Hello everyone, welcome to Res Snapper. My name's MJ and this is the in-depth deck guide for the consistent Mr Negative deck. We're going to be talking about the easiest way to climb in Marvel Snap and how this consistent Mr Negative deck fulfills that goal so well. We're going to be talking about the cards that you can substitute in this deck and cards which you really need. We're going to be talking about the perfect turn by turn for the whole game. We're going to be talking about the biggest weaknesses. We're going to talk about how people are stupid when they play against Mr Negative, and all whilst this is going on, I'll put some gameplay or something to the side or somewhere. I don't know how I'm laying this out yet, but you're seeing it with your eyes right now, so good. Let's just get into it. So in my humble opinion, the easiest way to rank up, climb, gain cubes in Marvel Snap, and this certainly it speaks to ladder, maybe less so conquest, but I think it's a similar sort of vibe. The easiest way is to have a definitive knowledge of when you need to snap with any given deck. Now, for players with a lot of skill, which maybe is not myself, but for players with a lot of skill, you may know when you're in a good position based on the locations that you've got, based on the cards that you've got. But for decks like the Mr Negative deck, and also similar decks that I like playing, like the Nimrod deck, it really helps me personally to have a definitive point at which I know I need to snap. So a set of conditions that need to be fulfilled in order for me to go, right, I need to snap with this game. And with this deck, the consistent Negative deck, it's when you've got Zabu on 2 and you've got Mr Negative. If you've got those two things, it's borderline completely irrelevant whatever else is going on apart from locations. I would say wait until at least 2 locations have been revealed. So if you've got an opening hand with Zabu and Mr Negative in, I wouldn't say turn 1 snap. I would say until at least wait until at least turn 2, so you know 2 locations. In most cases, guys, I'd probably say wait until the 3rd location is revealed. And don't snap straight away. Don't be like, oh, boom, I know this location's incredible for me. Because it gives a flag to your opponent. Whereas if you wait a little bit into turn 3 and then snap, they're a little bit more invested in the game. And you can squeeze as many cubes out of them as possible. On to the next point, the Mr Negative archetype is quite a unique archetype in Marvel Snap. Now this deck has quite a high curve and it relies fairly heavily on cards being flipped. Now it doesn't mean that you can't win games if you don't draw Mr Negative. You can still pop off, especially with the Magik in here giving you a turn 7. You can do spicy things. It just makes it much harder. So generally, if I don't draw Mr Negative and my hand is terrible, which will happen to you fairly often, I just retreat. This style of deck, it relies on the 8 cubers, it relies on the 4 cubers, and that you have so many of them that it outnumbers all of your quick little retreats that you just get rid of. Like oftentimes I'll just absolutely bail out of a game, turn 3, nothing's popping off, I've got dead hand, bail out of there for 1 cube, and then come back stronger in the next game with an 8 cuber. The really fascinating thing with Mr Negative decks is that I've especially noticed it climbing this season. People are just absolutely stupid playing against it. Like, honestly, I cannot believe the amount of people that actually stay in either for the full 8 cubes, or honestly, like, I can be playing conservatively. Maybe locations are going against me, maybe my hand isn't the best, but I'll get Mr Negative down maybe on turn 4. I'm not so confident that I've snapped at this point, but then my opponent snaps on me on turn 6. Or turn 7 with Magik, obviously, and I'll be like, well, I'm not super confident that I know I'm going to win because I didn't get that negs out early, but let's play it through, let's see what they've got, and then they've just got nothing, and you just absolutely dominate them anyway. But anyway, like I say, guys, you definitely want to be snapping if you've got the goated combo, Zabu and Mr Negative, and you'll be able to capitalise on those few times when your opponents are stupid and they stay in when Mr Negative has basically the highest power output on the final turn out of any archetype in the entire game. Substitutions. Now let's talk about substitutions for this specific deck, which I am calling consistent Mr Negative, because to me it just feels like the most consistent version that I've ever used. These are the cards in this particular deck that I would say that do not take these out. They can't be substituted. So we've got Yondu. Yondu is really important in this particular flavour of Mr. Negative because of our Knull. Knull, when flipped, is a 0-6, which is decent because it means when you Arnim Zola the Knull becomes a 12. So you've got 12 in 2 locations. Super good, super important. Yondu is really important in this deck because not only does it boost up that number potentially exponentially, like if you hit an Enchantress, that's an extra 5. Moving that or extrapolating that out over the course of the game, 10, 20, whatever. So super important. It also is important because you can just get something down on the board early game. You also do need to filter cards out of your hand. But also in those games where you don't flip Knull, maybe you do flip everything else. You might flip Arnim Zola, you might flip other stuff, so you can still play like Mystique and Iron Man, but you don't have that flipped Knull. That's also where Yondu is super important. Sometimes you are going to whiff. You'll hit their Sunspot or their Morbius, and it won't do anything to the Knull. But Yondu is an important card here. Next up, Zabu. Now, this particular version doesn't have Psylocke in. I dropped Psylocke. I used to run Psylocke and Zabu in all of my negative decks, but honestly, since I've dropped one of them being Psylocke, I've just found so much more consistent power. Because if you do run both, you run the risk of drawing one of them being flipped, which is never what you want. There's very few cards in this deck which you don't want to draw flipped. Basically, Crystal, Zabu and Yondu are the only ones that don't benefit from being flipped. And you want to keep the number of cards that don't benefit from being flipped down as low as possible. Zabu, of course, enables Mr. Negative on turn 3, which borderline guarees you the win. I'm not sure I want to say it guarantees it, but I just did. But it's so strong, having at least 3 card draws that are flipped is just absolutely crazy in this deck. Moving on to Mystique, super important. The flipped ongoing cards that we've got in this deck and our primary win conditions are Iron Man and Knull. And Mystique being able to copy either one of those is absolutely explosive and going to be massively key. Next up is Crystal. You may be wondering, what on earth are you doing running Crystal? Crystal is the worst card in the game. Well, since they buffed her, when I first saw the buff, I was like, I wonder if that's a little too small. I thought maybe she could be a 4/5 or something like that. But honestly, I have grown to love her with this deck. I have genuinely fallen in love with her. Not in a weird way. Well, sort of a little bit in a weird way. I want to... bad. But crucially, she doesn't even feel bad if you flip her. Like, if you flip her and draw into her on 5, or 4 if you've got negs down early, doesn't feel bad. You're playing a 4/4, so you're just playing decent power, and not amazing power, of course, but just decent power, which is also really important in this deck when you're playing things like Iron Man. You might not have locations with tons and tons of power, so Crystal having the solid 4 is really good, and she draws you one of your flipped cards. Like, this is the whole point of it. She literally draws into your flipped cards. It raises the probability of drawing any given card in your deck, which is your win conditions. That is what you want to draw. Maybe you play Crystal on 4 and you draw into Magik. So strong, gives you that extra turn. Basically, it gets you even closer to making sure that you draw everything. Now, there is a conversation here about whether you should have Jane Foster. I nearly called her Jane Jaw just because that's the name of a deck. But Jane Foster. I just haven't got on with using Jane Foster in the Mr. Negative archetype. I know that's absolutely busted and incredible and insane when you do play her for the 5/8, she's not flipped, and you literally draw just absolutely ridiculous amounts of power. But this deck, this version, gets there anyway. And you don't run into the risk of, maybe if you're playing the version with Jane Foster in, maybe you play Mr. Negative on turn 4, maybe you draw Jane on 5, she's flipped, and it's basically an auto loss. So that's why I like Crystal here over that. Shang-Chi, super important. One of the key ways that you win with this deck deck is by not having priority, which means that you're not susceptible to Enchantress, to other Shang-Chis. So you've not got priority, so it means that you can kill their big stuff, which obviously feeds into your Knull. And Shang-Chi's just good flipped as well. Next up, Iron Man, one of the best cards in the game when flipped. Literally just insane. I don't need to explain anything other than it synergizes with Mystique, of course. Magik is giving us that extra turn. Feels bad on the occasion that you draw her flipped and at the end of the game, or well, flipped or otherwise, but certainly at the end of the game on turn 6 when you physically can't play her, but those games are few and far between. Many often times you're going to be drawing her and you're going to be prolonging the game and giving you more chance to draw into your win conditions and your explosive cards. And then Knull I've spoken about at length anyway, but just it's absolutely sick. And then Arnim Zola, really important to talk about Arnim Zola because the overall way that you should play this deck is by keeping one location free. Zola is a massive part of your win condition because you're going to either want to be duplicating your Iron Man or your Knull or your Mystique. Duplicating any one of those is fine, and creating it in the other location. So it's important to keep one location free. That is the primary win condition of this deck. So keep a location free. So these are the cards that I wouldn't substitute from this version. It doesn't mean that you can play Mr. Negative decks, that you can't play Mr. Negative decks without these cards. I would just say there would be different versions. So with this version, you've got your Knull and your Yondu and your Shang-Chi as this little like sub-destroy package. If you don't have Knull, I would maybe take out certainly Yondu and go a different route with it. I'd go probably like a Bast, maybe a Bast, Korg, Darkhawk route. I'd probably do something like that. But those are the cards that I wouldn't substitute. Now onto the cards that I would substitute, or other substitutions. So other great cards that could work in this deck, certainly other Mr. Negative decks as well, but certainly this one. Hitmonkey, obviously just good flipped and can grow loads in power. Rogue steals an ability from your opponent, can be good in niche scenarios. I'm not the biggest fan of her generally just because it's just inconsistent in knowing whether you're going to be playing against an ongoing deck, and if they're not playing an ongoing deck, she is a bit of a dead card. She's a 2/3 when flipped, so not helping you out massively. Ironheart is a card that I actually do have in my base consistent Mr. Negative deck. I think she's incredible. Adding that extra power, spreading it about, she helps to buff up your Mr. Negative, which can really drag you down in any given specific location. And when flipped, she's crazy. She's like a 12 when flipped. Or no, that's not quite true actually. She's a 9. She's a 0/9 when flipped, which is super good. You know, there may be the odd occasion when you Arnim Zola her, and she's a 0/18. So, and that's wide as well. Obviously, she's spreading power throughout the board, so she's wide, which is why I really like her in Negative. In this current version that I'm climbing with of the consistent Negative, I play Wolfsbane. You've probably not been seeing it in the gameplay clips because there's at this precise moment in time, there is a quest or mission on to play Patriot in your deck. So I am utilising Super-Skrull sorry, not utilise. I'm capitalising on people using Patriot by having Super-Skrull in my deck, because it might mean that they're playing a wider no ability deck, which means they might have Khazar and Blue Marvel as well. Bishop I really like in the Mr. Negative archetype. Obviously when flipped it's a 1/3 and that can grow and grow and grow, and it goes quite vertical. Darkhawk, mentioned a minute ago, a decent sub in. I've also talked about Jane Foster as well. White Tiger, very solid. My issue with White Tiger is that she can fill the board up a bit, so it doesn't work quite so well with like things like Arnim Zola. Now, what does work well with Arnim Zola, of course, is Black Panther. Really cool card. When flipped, becomes a 10, of course, a 4/10 on reveal. And then if you've got Zola, you've got absolutely explosive power. And then Blue Marvel. Honestly, Blue Marvel is probably the key card here that I'd want to experiment with the most. I may even swap out Wolfsbane for Blue Marvel after I finish climbing with this deck. But those are the substitutions I'd say you could put in. So what does your perfect turn-by-turn play look like in the consistent Mr. Negative deck? Of course, you only have one one energy card in the deck. So it's Yondu on 1, Zabu on 2, Mr Negative on 3. If you've got that, snap as soon as the final location is revealed, and you know it's not going to fuck you. Then turn 4, you want to be playing Crystal if you've got it, because you're pumping that full 4 power out. Turn 5, Magik, you're prolonging the game. Now, whilst all of this is happening, you're focusing on 2 locations. You've probably sort of half filled one, and you might have 3 or so cards in another. That's how I like to play this deck, and that's how I generally, to be honest, I don't really want to go above 2 in any given location, just so that we can do maximum Zola shenanigans and options on the final turn, depending on what our opponent does, right? And then our turn 6, we're either passing, just complete pass, or we might be doing like a Shang-Chi or an Ironheart. Ironheart generally means that we are not gaining priority. As I mentioned earlier, it's so important with this deck that we do not have priority. So that's why generally you don't actually want to do anything on 6. Or 5 if you've not drawn Magik, of course. Yeah, generally you're not going to be doing much, or if you are, so maybe you are playing Crystal, which is 4 power, so conceivably you could gain priority upon playing Crystal. Player in a location with other cards, player where you're not going to gain priority, because it's important that you don't have it, because we are so weak to things like Enchantress. And turn 7 is your absolute power play. This is where you need to be so careful with the order that you play cards. Generally, your turn 7 is going to look like this. On your clear location, you play Knull. On a location where you've got 2 slots, you play Mystique. Then on back to that first location, you play Arnim Zola to copy the Knull into 2 other locations. It means you've got a double Knull in one location and a single Knull in the other. And then you're either playing Shang-Chi as the other card there, or basically you're dumping your hand. You're doing whatever else you need to do to secure the win. Now that might be flipped and maybe not Knull, maybe it's Iron Man instead. Whatever happens, you're probably going to win. That is an absolutely colossal power output, and if you have not got priority, there's very little they can do to stop it. Now, that brings us on to the biggest weaknesses of the deck. The ways that they can win. Aero and move manipulation cards, so maybe Polaris, you need to be careful of that, or at least aware of it. Honestly, if they're playing Aero and they do fuck up your complicated order of play or anything like that, you know, it's not going to happen every game, and you just have to count the losses when they come through, right? But there's a couple of big weaknesses that the deck has. As I said, I've mentioned it several times. Enchantress and Rogue, that sort of thing, is absolutely catastrophic. That will just annihilate you. So that's why you need to not have priority, basically. So that's the first thing to be aware of. But that is something that you're somewhat in control of, right? We're somewhat in control of whether we have priority or not. So that honestly is something that you can handle, you can deal with. Something that you can't handle and you can't deal with this deck is Scarlet Witch and the Reality Stone taking away the turn 7. That's what makes the pass on 6 quite dangerous, of course, because they pull the rug from underneath you. Now, you need to just be aware of when that could happen. If you've the massive telltale sign is when you play Magik and they instantly snap. That says to you that next turn is your final turn. 100%. Be super wary of that, because it means you can capitalize on it. If you are flipped and if you've got negs, you've got things like your Iron Man, your Knull, and maybe your Zola, or some combination of that. So you can definitely snatch the win. You know they're going to try and snatch the win with probably Scarlet Witch if you're not against a Thanos deck. You know it's probably going to be Scarlet Witch, which means they haven't got that much energy to play elsewhere. So just be conscious and be aware of that. And what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, the other telltale sign is oh sorry, the other weakness I should say is wave. So again, if they're snapping going into turn 5, or especially if they're snapping back going into turn 5 and the cards aren't revealed yet, be conscious of the kind of deck that they're playing and whether it could have wave. So ramp decks probably going to have wave, and so you're going to want to dump your hand. Ignore the previous advice that we don't want priority. Dump your hand on 5. And just be conscious of what they might play. And I think that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you very much for watching this in-depth deck guide. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful. Let me know how you get on with the Mr Negative climb. I personally have been getting on absolutely incredibly this season. So I reset back to 73 and I'm now on 93 in only like a handful of hours of play. So it's just going really smoothly. I've had a couple of stalling periods where I haven't been getting Mr Negative, but you just, like I say, guys, you just retreat. You know the start of the deck. You're going to be having your 8 cubes and your 4 cubes. You just take those retreats as they come, and you look for the big wins. As again I said, thank you for watching. This outro is turning terribly. If you're new, subscribe, and if you're old, that's great. Like the video, probably. Hopefully you've already done it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.